He was the general every German feared. The one commander Hitler's forces respected above all others. His army moved faster, hit harder, and won more decisively than any other Allied force in Europe. But the same fury that made him a battlefield genius nearly destroyed him. One moment of rage in a hospital tent almost ended his career. 2 slaps heard around the world. Was George Patton America's greatest warrior, or a deeply flawed man who happened to be brilliant at war? The answer might surprise you. August 10, 1943. A hospital tent in Sicily. The air is thick with the smell of antiseptic and blood. Wounded soldiers lie on cots, some missing limbs, others bandaged from head to toe. Into this tent walks a 4-star general, immaculate in his uniform, twin ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, boots gleaming. He moves from bed to bed, handing out Purple Hearts, offering words of encouragement. Then he stops at one soldier sitting on a cot, apparently unwounded. "What's wrong with you?" the general demands. The soldier mumbles something about his nerves, about being unable to take it anymore. The general's face turns crimson. In an instant, he rips off his gloves and slaps the soldier across the face. "You coward!" he screams. "I won't have these brave men here who've been shot seeing a yellow bastard crying." He slaps him again, then pulls out his pistol and waves it in the soldier's face. "I ought to shoot you myself right now." Nurses rush forward. Other officers intervene. The general storms out, leaving chaos in his wake. That general was George Patton. That moment nearly ended his career and would haunt him for the rest of his life. But it also reveals the paradox of the man. A brilliant military commander whose own demons threatened to destroy everything he accomplished. Was he a genius? Absolutely. Was he also deeply flawed? Without question. This is the story of the most controversial American general of World War II. A man who won battles and alienated allies in equal measure, who inspired fierce loyalty and provoked intense hatred, who helped win a war but couldn't win the battle with himself. San Gabriel, California, November 11, 1885. George Smith Patton Jr. was born into privilege and expectations. His family wasn't just wealthy, they were Southern California aristocracy. His grandfather, George Smith Patton Sr., had been a Confederate colonel killed in the Civil War, a fact young George would hear about his entire childhood. His father was a successful lawyer and politician. The Pattons lived on a ranch where young George learned to ride horses almost before he could walk. But there was something different about this boy. He struggled terribly with reading and writing, what we'd now recognize as severe dyslexia. School was torture for him. Words jumbled on the page. Letters reversed themselves. His parents hired tutors, but nothing seemed to help. Young George felt stupid, inadequate, humiliated. Other children his age were reading fluently while he struggled with simple sentences. He threw tantrums, broke things in frustration, and once even considered running away from home. The shame of being unable to do what came easily to others ate at him. But he discovered something that came naturally: military history. His father would read to him for hours from the classics, Homer's Iliad, accounts of Alexander the Great, stories of Napoleon's campaigns. George would sit mesmerized, absorbing every detail, memorizing entire battles. He had a photographic memory for spoken information, even though written words escaped him. He could recite passages from the Iliad after hearing them once. He knew the order of battle for Cannaby and Austerlitz and Waterloo. His mind was like a military encyclopedia, storing tactical details, strategic decisions, and the names of every significant commander in history. He developed a peculiar belief, one he'd hold his entire life. He had lived before as a great warrior. He claimed to remember being a Greek hoplite at the Battle of Marathon, a Roman legionnaire with Caesar, a knight at Crécy during the 100 Years' War. Whether he genuinely believed this or used it as psychological armor against his learning disabilities, it shaped his identity. George Patton wasn't just going to be a soldier. He was destined to be a great warrior, continuing a lineage that stretched back through the centuries. At 18, he entered the Virginia Military Institute for a year before securing an appointment to West Point in 1904. The academy was brutal, designed to break weak men and forge the rest into officers. Patton struggled academically, especially with French and mathematics. He had to repeat his first year, a humiliation he never forgot. But in tactics, military history, and anything involving physical prowess, he excelled. He became a champion swordsman and competed in the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishing 5th despite being robbed of a better placement when judges claimed his bullets had gone through existing holes in the target. After graduating in 1909, Patton was commissioned as a cavalry officer. In 1910, he married Beatrice Eyre, daughter of a wealthy Boston industrialist. Their courtship had been intense and romantic. Patton pursued Beatrice with the same determination he brought to everything else. He wrote her passionate letters, visited her family estate, and made clear his intentions. Beatrice was intelligent, cultured, and sophisticated, everything Patton admired. She was also independently wealthy, which allowed Patton to live far beyond his army salary, keeping polo ponies and maintaining the lifestyle he felt a Patton deserved. Their wedding was a grand affair in Beverly, Massachusetts, with Patton's fellow officers forming a sword arch for the couple. Beatrice would be his anchor for 35 years, putting up with his infidelities, his rages, his impossible ego, because she too believed in his destiny. She once told a friend that she'd married a man who would either become famous or end up in prison, and she wasn't sure which was more likely. Their marriage produced 3 children: Beatrice, Ruth Ellen, and George IV, who would also become a general. Patton became obsessed with the cavalry saber, studying fencing in France and designing a new sword for the U.S. cavalry. The Patton sword was adopted in 1913 and would be used by American cavalry officers for years. He wrote the Army's Manual on Saber Tactics. But even as he mastered the sword, he recognized that the future of warfare lay in mechanization. When World War I broke out in Europe, Patton studied the new weapons emerging: machine guns, tanks, aircraft. When America entered the war in 1917, Patton was 31 years old and desperate to see combat. He pulled every string he could, using his wife's social connections and his own relentless lobbying. He bombarded his superiors with requests for combat assignments. He wrote letters to influential politicians. He even considered resigning his commission to join the French Foreign Legion if it meant getting to the front. Finally, he was assigned to General John J. Pershing's staff and sailed to France. There, he witnessed tank warfare for the first time and immediately grasped its potential. The British and French were using tanks as slow-moving infantry support, but Patton saw something different. He envisioned massed tank formations breaking through enemy lines, racing deep into the rear areas, creating chaos and panic. It was cavalry warfare adapted to the modern age. He volunteered to command the new American Tank Corps and was given command of the 1st Tank Brigade. Patton threw himself into his new role with characteristic intensity. He traveled to French tank schools, studied British tank tactics at Cambrai, and personally drove every model of tank he could get his hands on. He designed training programs, wrote doctrine, and handpicked his officers and crews. He demanded that his men understand not just how to drive and fire a tank, but how to maintain it, repair it in the field, and fight as a coordinated unit. His training was so thorough that when his brigade finally saw action, they performed better than units with more combat experience. In September 1918, during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, Patton finally got his chance for glory. He led his tanks into battle on foot, waving his walking stick, directing traffic in the middle of machine gun fire. It was insane bravery, exactly what he'd always imagined. Then a bullet struck him in the thigh, a serious wound that ended his war. But he'd proven himself in combat and earned the Distinguished Service Cross. After the war came the long frustration of peacetime. The Army shrank dramatically. Promotions stopped. Patton spent the 1920s and 1930s at various cavalry posts, studying military history, writing papers on mechanized warfare, and growing increasingly frustrated. He was convinced another war was coming and that tanks would dominate it, but the Army's cavalry establishment resisted mechanization. These were difficult years. Patton battled depression, suffered from what we'd now call PTSD from his war wound, and struggled with feelings of inadequacy. He had affairs, drank too much, and drove Beatrice to distraction with his moods. But he also prepared. He read everything about warfare he could find. He studied German military theory. He maintained his physical fitness with fanatical discipline. He waited for his moment, growing older, watching younger officers promoted past him, wondering if his chance would ever come. Then came World War II. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, Patton was 53 years old, still a colonel, seemingly passed over for high command. But the fall of France in 1940 shocked America into action. The army began expanding rapidly. Suddenly, there was demand for officers who understood mechanized warfare. Patton was promoted to brigadier general and given command of a new armored brigade. His moment had finally arrived. Patton was given command of the 2nd Armored Division and began training them with brutal intensity. He was a terror to his subordinates, demanding perfection in everything from tank maintenance to uniform appearance. Officers learned to dread his inspections. He would arrive unannounced, white-glove the equipment, check maintenance logs, quiz soldiers on their duties, and explode if anything was substandard. He fined officers for minor infractions like unshined boots or wrinkled uniforms, relieved commanders for failing inspections, and drove his men until they hated him. One of his innovations was requiring officers to wear neckties even in the field, a regulation that seemed absurd to men working on tanks in the Georgia heat. But Patton had a reason. He believed discipline in small things led to discipline in combat. If a soldier couldn't be bothered to dress properly, how could he be trusted to maintain his weapon or follow orders under fire? His men grumbled, called him names behind his back, and composed profane songs about him. But they also became superbly trained, the best armored division in the Army. When Patton's division conducted maneuvers in Tennessee and Louisiana, they crushed their opposition with tactics that seemed revolutionary. While other commanders used tanks to support infantry attacks, Patton sent his armor on wide sweeping flanks, cutting supply lines, encircling enemy positions, moving so fast the opposition couldn't react. His philosophy, developed over decades of study, was simple: grab the enemy by the nose and kick him in the ass. Fix them in place with one force, then hit them from an unexpected direction with your mobile units. It was blitzkrieg before Americans called it that, and it marked Patton as exceptional, a man who understood modern warfare in ways most American generals didn't. After Pearl Harbor, Patton was promoted to Major General and given command of the Western Task Force for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa in November 1942. It was his first independent command in combat, landing American forces in Morocco. The landings succeeded, though there was confusion and some unnecessary casualties. Patton's force linked up with other Allied units pushing east from Algeria, and by early 1943, American forces were engaged against the legendary German Afrika Korps commanded by Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. In February 1943, American forces suffered a humiliating defeat at Kasserine Pass. Green American troops were routed by experienced German forces. The defeat shocked American leadership. Someone had to restore discipline and fighting spirit to the demoralized II Corps. Eisenhower, the supreme commander, chose Patton. He was given 2 weeks to turn II Corps around before the next offensive. Patton arrived like a whirlwind. He immediately instituted strict uniform regulations. Everyone had to wear helmets and ties, even in combat zones. He imposed heavy fines for uniform violations. He relieved officers he deemed incompetent. He drove himself everywhere in his command car, appearing at the front lines, at supply depots, wherever his men were. The soldiers hated the chicken shit regulations, the fines for not wearing leggings properly, but they noticed that ammunition arrived on time, that broken-down tanks got repaired quickly, that their general was always there, sharing their danger. In just 2 weeks, Patton transformed II Corps. When they went back into action, they fought with new confidence and aggression. At El Getter, they defeated a German counterattack, the first clear American victory against the Afrika Korps. Patton's reputation soared. Here was an American general who could beat the Germans. After North Africa fell in May 1943, Patton was given command of the 7th Army for the invasion of Sicily. Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, was Patton's masterpiece and also the beginning of his troubles. He was partnered with British General Bernard Montgomery, commanding the 8th Army. Montgomery was Patton's opposite in many ways. Cautious, methodical, personally modest but professionally arrogant. The two men despised each other. The invasion plan gave Montgomery the main role, pushing up the eastern coast toward Messina, while Patton's 7th Army was supposed to protect Montgomery's flank. Patton hated playing second fiddle. As soon as his troops were ashore, he began lobbying for a more aggressive role. When he saw an opening, he launched his army in a mad dash across Sicily, racing Montgomery to Messina. It was militarily unnecessary, a waste of resources, but it was glorious. Patton's troops covered incredible distances, fought through mountainous terrain, and entered Messina hours before Montgomery's forces arrived. Patton stood in the city square, grinning, waiting to greet Montgomery. It was a public relations triumph and made Patton famous back home. But then came the slapping incidents. On August 3rd and again on August 10th, Patton encountered soldiers hospitalized for combat fatigue, what we now call PTSD. Patton intellectually knew combat fatigue existed, but emotionally he rejected it and viewed it as moral weakness. To him, these men were cowards, shirkers, letting down their buddies who were getting killed. Both times, he lost his temper and physically assaulted the soldiers. Both times, there were witnesses, including reporters. Eisenhower heard about the incidents and was furious. He needed Patton, who was arguably his best combat commander, but this was inexcusable. Eisenhower covered it up temporarily, ordering Patton to apologize to the soldiers, to their medical staff, and to every division in his command. Patton gave the apologies, though they seemed to choke him. But the story leaked to American newspapers. The public outcry was enormous. Congressmen demanded Patton be relieved. Veterans groups condemned him. For months, Eisenhower kept Patton on ice, unsure whether to fire him or use him. Patton spent the fall and winter of 1943 to 44 in limbo. He was in England, supposedly preparing for the invasion of France, but actually serving as a decoy. The Allies wanted the Germans to think Patton would command the invasion, so they created a phantom army in southeast England with Patton as its visible commander. It was perfect deception, because the Germans respected Patton more than any other Allied general. They couldn't believe the Allies would leave him out of the real invasion. The months of inactivity were torture for Patton. He was 58 years old, watching younger generals get the glory while he sat on the sidelines. He gave a speech at a welcome club that was supposed to be off the record, where he joked that after the war, America and Britain would rule the world together. The press got hold of it, leaving out that he'd also mentioned the Soviet Union, making it sound like he was dismissing America's Russian allies. There was another outcry. Eisenhower nearly fired him. Patton wrote in his diary that he was cursed, that destiny had brought him so close only to snatch victory away. But Eisenhower needed him. After D-Day, when the Allies were fighting to break out of Normandy, Eisenhower activated Patton's Third Army. On August 1, 1944, Patton was finally back in action. And what followed was one of the most spectacular advances in military history. Patton's Third Army broke through the German lines and raced across France. They covered distances in days that were supposed to take weeks. Patton's philosophy was simple. Hold them by the nose and kick them in the pants. Find the enemy, fix them in place, then send your armor around their flanks. Never stop moving. Never give them time to set up defenses. His famous order to his commanders was, "I don't want to get any messages saying, 'I am holding my position.' We're not holding anything. Let the Hun do that. We are advancing constantly." In 2 weeks, Third Army advanced hundreds of miles across France, helped enable the liberation of Paris, crossed the Seine, and was approaching the German border. They were running on fumes, literally. The supply situation was desperate. Everything had to come from the Normandy beaches, hundreds of miles behind the advancing armies. Trucks worked around the clock on the Red Ball Express. But there wasn't enough fuel, ammunition, or food for all the Allied armies. Eisenhower had to make a choice. Give the limited supplies to Montgomery in the north or to Patton in the south. Montgomery argued for a single concentrated thrust into Germany. Patton argued that his army was already moving and should be supplied. Eisenhower chose a compromise, the broad front strategy, which meant everybody got some supplies but nobody got enough. Patton's advance stalled in September, miles from the Rhine. Patton was furious. He believed, probably correctly, that if he'd been given the supplies, he could have crossed the Rhine and been into Germany by October, potentially ending the war months earlier. Instead, he sat and watched as Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden, an airborne assault to seize bridges in Holland. When Market Garden failed disastrously, Patton's anger knew no bounds. He'd been held back so Montgomery could have his chance, and Montgomery had blown it. In September 1944, the Germans launched their surprise counteroffensive through the Ardennes, creating the Battle of the Bulge. It was Hitler's last desperate gamble, throwing his remaining panzer reserves against a weak section of the American line, hoping to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The attack came through heavily forested terrain in terrible weather that grounded Allied aircraft. American forces were caught completely off guard and driven back in confusion. Entire regiments were surrounded. The situation was desperate, perhaps the greatest crisis the Allies faced in Western Europe. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of his commanders at Verdun on December 19th. The mood was grim. German panzers were driving deep into Belgium. American units were surrounded at Bastogne and elsewhere. Some commanders talked about retreating, shortening their lines, giving up territory to stabilize the situation. Montgomery, commanding forces to the north, was his usual cautious self, talking about the need for careful preparation before counterattacking. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton and asked the question that would define Patton's finest moment. "When can you attack?" The room fell silent. Everyone knew Third Army was 100 miles to the south, fully engaged in their own offensive toward the Saar region. Disengaging from that battle, turning 90 degrees north, and launching a coordinated attack into the German flank would require moving 3 entire divisions, with all their tanks, artillery, and supplies over icy roads in the middle of winter. Patton didn't hesitate. On December 22nd, with 3 divisions. The other commanders thought he was insane or grandstanding. That was only 3 days away, not even 72 hours. Montgomery said it would take weeks to organize such an operation. Other commanders talked about the difficulties, the weather, the roads, the logistics. Even Eisenhower looked skeptical, though he knew Patton well enough to take him seriously. But Patton had already worked it out with his staff. He'd been studying the German offensive since it began and had anticipated that he might be called upon to counterattack. He'd secretly ordered his staff to prepare 3 contingency plans for attacking north, each involving different numbers of divisions. His staff had done the impossible work of planning how to disengage from their current battle, move 3 divisions 100 miles in winter, and attack into a confused battle space where American and German units were all mixed together. The plans were ready. All Patton needed was Eisenhower's order. On December 22nd, as promised, Patton attacked north into the German flank. It was a masterpiece of military planning and execution. Third Army relieved the surrounded garrison at Bastogne and drove the Germans back. By January, the Bulge was eliminated. It was Patton's finest hour, the moment when his genius shone brightest. In March 1945, Third Army crossed the Rhine, and Patton was in his element, racing across Germany, his tanks advancing faster than the Germans could retreat. He crossed the river at Oppenheim, south of Mainz, using a brilliant tactical surprise. While Montgomery in the north was preparing an elaborate crossing with massive artillery support, airborne drops, and weeks of preparation, Patton simply seized a bridge that the Germans hadn't fully destroyed and got his troops across before the enemy could react. He called Eisenhower to report the crossing and couldn't resist a dig at Montgomery. "We're across. Without the benefit of aerial bombardment, ground smoke, artillery preparation, or airborne assistance." It was classic Patton, brilliant tactically but needlessly antagonizing his allies. As Third Army drove deeper into Germany, they began liberating concentration camps. Ohrdruf was the first, then Buchenwald. What Patton and his soldiers found there was beyond anything they'd imagined. The skeletal survivors, the piles of corpses, the gas chambers, the crematoria, the systematic industrialization of murder. Patton, who'd seen death in many forms, who'd walked battlefields covered with bodies, was physically sickened. He vomited after touring Ohrdruf. But he also immediately understood the historical importance of what they'd discovered. He ordered his soldiers to photograph and film everything. He brought in German civilians from nearby towns and forced them to tour the camps, to see what had been done in their name. When some claimed they didn't know what had been happening, Patton was contemptuous. He made local officials bury the dead with their own hands. Years later, he would say that the camps were the one thing that made him glad he'd fought in the war, that stopping such evil justified every casualty, every hardship, every sacrifice. He reached Czechoslovakia and wanted to keep going to Prague, but Eisenhower ordered him to stop. Prague had been agreed upon as part of the Soviet zone, and politics now trumped military opportunity. Patton was furious. He'd never understood politics, never accepted that military decisions were subordinate to political considerations. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Patton was arguably the most famous general in America. He was on magazine covers, in newsreels, beloved by the public for his toughness and his victories. Soldiers from Third Army came home telling stories about old blood and guts, about the general who'd led them to victory, who'd gotten them home alive. Patton received a hero's welcome whenever he appeared in public. He gave speeches to huge crowds. He was mentioned as a potential presidential candidate. For a brief moment, George Patton had everything he'd ever dreamed of: fame, recognition, vindication of his belief in his own destiny. But peace was harder for him than war. He was appointed military governor of Bavaria, and it was a disaster from the start. Patton didn't understand occupation policy, didn't care about denazification, and couldn't grasp why the political situation in defeated Germany mattered. He'd spent his entire career thinking about how to destroy the enemy, not how to rebuild after victory. He didn't see why he couldn't use former Nazi officials to help run things. They were, he argued, the only Germans with administrative experience, the ones who knew how the bureaucracy worked, how to keep the trains running and the electricity on. When American occupation officials told him to remove all former Nazis from positions of authority, Patton resisted. He made statements comparing the Nazi Party to Republicans and Democrats back home, saying they were just political parties, that most members had joined for practical reasons rather than ideological ones. He said this to reporters, creating a firestorm. The press crucified him. Jewish veterans groups were outraged, pointing out that this political party had murdered 6 million Jews. Eisenhower was flooded with demands that Patton be fired immediately. Patton was bitter, angry, and increasingly reckless in his statements. He believed the real enemy was now the Soviet Union and that America should attack them immediately, while American forces were already mobilized in Europe. He said this publicly, creating an international incident. In September 1945, Eisenhower relieved him of command of Third Army, giving him a meaningless paper job. On December 9, 1945, Patton was riding in a staff car near Mannheim, Germany, when his vehicle collided with a truck. Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. For 12 days, he lay in a hospital, knowing he would never walk again, never ride a horse, never lead troops. He told Beatrice, who'd rushed from America to be with him, that this was a hell of a way for a soldier to die. On December 21, 1945, he died of an embolism. He was 60 years old. Patton was buried in Luxembourg, among the soldiers of Third Army who had died in battle. He'd asked not to be buried in America, saying he wanted to be with his men. Thousands attended his funeral. Eisenhower wept. Even Montgomery sent condolences. The warrior was finally at rest. So what do we make of George Patton? Was he a genius? Militarily, absolutely. His understanding of mobile warfare, his grasp of how to use tanks as breakthrough weapons, his emphasis on speed and aggression, his ability to inspire soldiers to superhuman efforts, all of this marks him as one of history's great combat commanders. The numbers don't lie. Third Army advanced farther and faster, captured more territory, took more prisoners, and suffered fewer casualties relative to its achievements than any other Allied army in Europe. When Patton had supplies and room to maneuver, he was unstoppable. But he was also deeply flawed. His treatment of soldiers suffering from combat fatigue was inexcusable, rooted in his inability to understand that courage isn't unlimited, that even the bravest men can break under sustained combat. His ego was monumental. He genuinely seemed to believe he was a reincarnated warrior, destined for greatness, and anyone who didn't recognize this was an idiot or a coward. He had terrible judgment about when to keep his mouth shut. Time and again, he nearly destroyed his career with careless statements, inappropriate comments, or actions that showed staggering insensitivity. He held views that were deeply prejudiced, troubling even to many of his contemporaries. His attitudes toward African Americans, Jews, Arabs, and others outside his narrow social circle were appalling. He used ethnic slurs casually. He resisted integrating black soldiers into combat units. When forced to accept them, he was surprised when they fought well, as if their courage was somehow unexpected. These weren't just personal prejudices. They affected his military decisions and the opportunities given to soldiers under his command. His relationship with Beatrice was complicated. He was unfaithful repeatedly, having affairs throughout their marriage. Yet he also depended on her emotionally and financially. She was his anchor, the one person who could manage his moods and his ego. Their letters reveal genuine affection alongside his infidelities. It's not a relationship modern audiences would admire. And yet, thousands of soldiers who served under him revered him. They hated his chicken shit regulations about uniforms. They resented his fines and his harsh discipline. But they also knew that Patton won battles, that under his command they were more likely to survive and return home. He trained them ruthlessly so they'd be ready for combat. He demanded excellence because he knew that mediocrity got people killed. And when the shooting started, Patton was there, not back at headquarters but up front where he could see the battlefield and his soldiers could see him. There's a photograph from the Battle of the Bulge. It shows Patton standing in snow, talking to a group of soldiers. They're cold, exhausted, filthy. But they're looking at him with something like hope. They believed in him. They believed that if anyone could get them out of this mess, it was old blood and guts, as they called him, though they also joked it was our blood and his guts. The question of whether Patton was a genius or a problematic hero presents a false choice. He was both. His military genius is undeniable. But so are his flaws, his prejudices, his cruelty, his inability to adapt to peace or to show compassion for the psychological wounds of war. We can acknowledge his brilliance while also recognizing that his character had deep flaws that hurt people and limited his effectiveness. What would Patton think of being judged by modern standards? He'd probably sneer and say something offensive. He was a man of his time in the worst ways, holding views that were common in his social class and generation but are rightly condemned today. And yet, even in his own time, his behavior was often seen as excessive. Eisenhower had to repeatedly rein him in. Marshall warned him about his conduct. Even fellow generals found him difficult and embarrassing. Perhaps the best way to understand Patton is to recognize that war brought out both his best and worst qualities. His aggression, his competitiveness, his physical courage, his obsession with winning, all served him brilliantly in combat. But these same traits made him a poor peacemaker, a terrible diplomat, and sometimes a cruel commander. He was built for war and lost when war ended. In the decades since his death, Patton has become almost mythical. Movies have portrayed him as a tragic hero, a warrior out of time. Some see him as proof that tough, old-fashioned leadership works. Others see him as an example of toxic masculinity and military brutality. Both views are too simple. The real George Patton was a complex, contradictory man who achieved greatness at terrible cost, both to himself and to others. He helped win World War II, liberating millions from Nazi tyranny. That matters. It matters immensely, but he also left a trail of hurt, humiliated soldiers, ruined careers, and damaged relationships. That matters too. For those who served under him, who survived the war and came home to build families and careers, Patton's memory remained complicated. Some remembered only the victories, the pride of serving in Third Army, the fastest army in Europe. Others remembered the casual cruelty, the public humiliations, the sense that they were just pieces on his chessboard. Most remembered both. What's clear is that we're unlikely ever to see another general quite like George S. Patton. Modern military leadership emphasizes different qualities: political awareness, cultural sensitivity, consensus building. The swashbuckling warrior general, for better or worse, belongs to a different era. Whether that's progress or loss depends on your perspective. What remains is the record of what he accomplished and what it cost. Third Army's dash across France and Germany helped end the war and liberate Europe. That liberation saved millions of lives and preserved freedom. Those are real achievements that justified the faith Eisenhower and Marshall placed in Patton despite his many problems. But the slapped soldiers, the crude prejudices, the unnecessary conflicts with allies, the inability to see soldiers as human beings rather than instruments of war, these are also part of his legacy. We don't honor Patton's memory by ignoring these failings. We honor it, and we honor the soldiers who served under him by seeing him complete, both the genius and the deeply flawed man. In the end, George S. Patton was exactly what America needed in 1944 and 1945. An aggressive, fearless combat commander who could break through German defenses and drive deep into enemy territory. But he was also a man whose demons, prejudices, and lack of self-control limited what he could accomplish and hurt people under his command. Both things are true. Both things matter. And both things need to be remembered if we're to understand not just Patton, but the complicated nature of heroism itself.